The Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge is one of the most important, if not the most important, priority area for conservation in the state of Florida.
We have one of the most biologically unique wild open spaces left in the country. That area also happens to be primarily ranch land. We are competing directly with the development industry. So there's already developments planned or permitted on a lot of these areas where you might look around and think you're in the middle of nowhere and say, hey, we have all the time in the world. We're in the middle of nowhere. This is gorgeous, and in reality, it's we're at a situation where all of these properties are at risk.
It sounds to me, Tom, like what you're saying is if you care about wetlands, or you care about important species, or you care about national wildlife refuges, or you care about public access, or you care about recreation, you care about safe drinking water, this is a refuge you should be caring about. Hi, and welcome to Refuge Chat. This is an extension of Refuge Radio, our podcast series about the National Wildlife Refuge Association and the nation's National Wildlife Refuge System, spanning more than 850 million acres of land and water as part of a growing network of 568 refuges, at least one in every state. Today, we're speaking with Julie Morris, the National Wildlife Refuge Association's Florida and Gulf Programs Manager, and her colleague from the University of Florida, Dr. Tom Hoctor. Julie, Tom, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, this is really exciting. As we talked before the start of the show, the objective here is to have an informative and interactive conversation with experts about what's happening in Florida, Florida conservation writ large, but specifically what's happening around the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge and the work that the two of you are doing. I know there's been some big developments down there just in the past few weeks here at the tail end of 2020. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity to chat with both of you. But not everybody knows you as well as I do. So Julie, do you mind taking the lead here and telling us a little bit of who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am the Florida and Gulf Program Manager for the National Wildlife Refuge Association, as you mentioned before. My work runs the gamut from lobbying to environmental education to science and land management and wildlife biology and land protection and real estate. So on any given day, I could be wearing multiple hats. My background is in wildlife ecology. My master's is in wildlife ecology from the University of Florida. And I started off as a wildlife biologist and moved into land protection. And so I have been working for over 23 years now in Southwest and South Central Florida on land conservation and wildlife issues in this region.
Wow, I would consider you the CWO of the Florida and Gulf programs, the chief whatever officer. It sounds like on any given day, you might have a different task and a different assignment. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Tom, tell us a little bit about you, where you come from and how you fit into the picture here.
Hi, I am the director of the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at the University of Florida. I was raised in Florida, have been here since 1966, got all my graduate degrees at the University of Florida, and as soon as I finished my PhD, started to work on research science related to wildlife ecology and landscape ecology at the university. So both as a graduate student and as a research scientist and as a professor, I've been at the University of Florida working on conservation work in Florida for about 30 years now. My work is more in the applied science, especially conservation biology, trying to identify the places that are most important for conserving wildlife species and for biodiversity. As my career has continued, I've gotten more involved in things like protecting water resources and identifying the most important places for protecting watersheds and restoring watersheds. Most of my work is in Florida, but I've worked in the southeastern United States and the United States as a whole with a number of both federal and state agencies, but I also work a lot with conservation organizations, including the National Wildlife Refuge Association.
Great. Thank you for that. So, what we're here to talk about in large part is the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. But I'm not sure when I say Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, everybody knows what I'm talking about. I'm certain that somebody who's living in here near Washington, D.C., or somewhere out west has heard of the Everglades, but not likely the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. And even those folks in Florida may not be particularly cued in on what it is. So, could the two of you walk me through what is the Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge and how did it come to be? I know it's got kind of an interesting backstory.
Sure. So the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, which I am going to refer to as the Headwaters for simplicity's sake, began in or was implemented in 2012. And it came to be, there was a tremendous grassroots effort on the ground from sportsmen, landowners, scientists, conservation organizations, and agencies, where it was recognized that this was one of the most biologically unique places in the United States that was also under tremendous threat. So I'm going to just point to this map, KB. But if you look at this red line right here, the Headwaters begins just south of Orlando, and it goes south all the way almost to Lake Okeechobee. It encompasses almost 1 million acres of one of the last great grassland savannas in North America. And most people, when they think of Florida, don't think of these wild grasslands that might rival, the African veldt or something like that, right? They think of beaches and Disney World, etc. Well, we have one of the most biologically unique wild open spaces left in the country. That area also happens to be primarily ranch lands. And when I say ranch lands, I mean cow-calf operations. So this is one of the last great cattle ranching areas in the country, and it is the heartland of Florida. So the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge began in 2012, and we had ranchers, sportsmen, scientists, NGOs, agencies coming together and saying, you know what, this is really, really important. Florida is developing rapidly. The land is being converted. And if we don't do something soon, we are going to lose this national treasure. So the United States Fish and Wildlife Service implemented the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, and it was always envisioned to be a partnership. So we had multiple state and federal agencies standing together and saying, you know what, we're all going to work together to conserve this because, we might have a lot of agencies are involved. Everyone has a little bit of money. No one has a lot. So we have to make sure that we are focused on those most strategic areas that are going to preserve viable wildlife populations and also preserve the water supply for South Florida. The Northern Everglades supplies water to over 8 million residents in South Florida, and most people don't recognize that. So the Headwaters is a different kind of refuge. The acquisition boundary, see this red line here, is almost 1 million acres north of Lake Okeechobee. The service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has the authority to purchase 50,000 acres of that fee simple. And when I say fee simple, I mean buying that land outright to preserve wildlife, water, and also public recreation areas. That's very important. Anything bought by the Fish and Wildlife Service will be public recreation. They also have the authority to purchase up to 100,000 acres of conservation easements. And when I say conservation easements, another way to say that is less than fee, right? Less than fee simple. So they're buying the development rights when they buy conservation easements, but they're not buying the land outright. And this is a tool that we see more and more in Florida and across the country because we simply do not have the funding. When I say we, I mean globally, state, federal, local agencies. We do not have the funding to purchase fee simple land outright of all the land we need to conserve our wildlife and water. Conservation easements, purchasing the development rights, are an important tool where that land can never be developed. It stays in private ownership, but that private landowner has to manage that land as it was bought or when the service or another agency put the easement on it. They have to manage it for its natural resources in perpetuity. That means forever. So that's a really long time. So the vision of the Headwaters is 50,000 acres, fee simple, 100,000 acres, less than fee, or conservation easements. Now, Tom and I will talk more about this, right? But we have a 1,000,000 acre acquisition boundary, right? The service has the authority to purchase 100 or protect 150,000 acres. So where Tom comes in and all of his work, which is invaluable, we work to make sure the most important areas are conserved, right? We want the biggest bang for our buck because we have to be
Sure.
really, really strategic. We have to focus on those areas that are most important for our endangered species, for our water. And so Tom and his data and his science, which is, cutting edge, it's a model for other states across the country. We work together to make sure that we are focused on the most important areas. So I think I've digressed a lot, but the Headwaters, that's what it is, 1,000,000 acres north of Orlando. That's where we focus the majority of our work. The Headwaters also encompasses Avon Park Air Force Range, which is a large Air Force range right in the, I'm going to hold up this map again. It's what we call a conservation hub. This Avon Park Air Force Range is kind of the main conservation hub in the region. But that area is important because that's where the Air Force trains before they head overseas. So protecting the area around Avon Air Force Range is really important in order for that range to stay mission ready, right? So we're really focused also on protecting that area so development doesn't interfere with flight paths or
Sure.
training exercises. And I just want to get a few more points across. The Headwaters, and specifically these ranch lands and these cow-calf operations, are the lowest intensity land use we can have in the region besides pristine areas that are never going to be touched. These cow-calf operations support a wide array of threatened and endangered species and rare habitats. So on these ranch lands, we find the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is the most endangered bird in the continental United States. These ranch lands are critical for supporting a viable population of the Florida panther, another one of our iconic endangered species. So the primary wildlife corridor in the state of Florida, which Tom is the author of, goes through the the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. So this area, truly is unique for a wide variety of purposes, not just the biodiversity, but also because of the cultural heritage of the region, where we have kind of the last vestiges of our cattle ranching, which, this state was built on ranching, and, it's being encroached by development. So we're working on a multitude of fronts there. And with that, I will
Well, I
defer
I
to
want to
Tom.
yeah, I want to hear from Tom on this too, but before I let you go on that, Julie, two follow-on questions. The first is that so there's a 1,000,000 acre acquisition boundary. That doesn't necessarily mean that the refuge will end up being 1,000,000 acres. That
Right.
means that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a large target that they can protect lands within. And then they have this permission slip for 150,000 acres, 50,000 of which fee simple, 100,000 acres less than fee through the conservation easements as you described them. Where are we today with fulfilling the promise of what the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge could be?
So that's an interesting question. It began in 2012, and we've gotten money. Congress has appropriated money each year. So right now we have a bit over 10,000 acres in combination of fee and less than fee. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but when we look at what U.S. Fish and Wildlife has done, leveraging funding and resources with other state and federal agencies, the number is a lot bigger, right? So this was always envisioned to be a team effort. The service, with just using land and water conservation funding, LWCF funding, which is what we use for acquisition in the refuge system. So right now they've protected over 10,000 acres, and there's a lot more in the pipeline. But this gets back to one of the other things we do, which is we fight hard to secure LWCF funding every year. And we're always very grateful for what we get. The harsh truth about Florida, though, is that our real estate prices are some of the highest in the nation. And so we are competing directly with the development industry or other industries that might be have use more intensive land uses, if that makes sense, like more intensive agribusiness for a better return on the dollar. So these lands are at risk of development or being converted to a more intensive type of land use. So, we're not, unfortunately in the middle of nowhere where we can use this money and take our time. You know, um, we truly are,
Under the
um,
gun.
we are
Yeah.
under the gun.
And that very much, that segues to what my second question was going to be. And I think you've answered it at this point, but a lot of people, when they hear cow calf operation, I think they see a feedlot in their head.
Mhm.
They see, dirty cows and streams, but I've been on these ranch lands that you're talking about. It's hard to tell the park from the ranch lands. And you can just answer this again for us. If they don't convert, or if they don't keep these ranch lands intact, what do they turn into? Do they become, developments and row crops, or where do they head? What happens if we don't fix this?
Well, I think, you can kind of, if you spend any time around Florida, which I know you have, that you can kind of see the progression where, where I'm sitting now, just a stone's throw away was all ranch lands. And now, we're looking at golf course communities in the headwaters. Um, when these ranch lands are converted, oftentimes they're converted to more intensive agriculture, which, will not support the wildlife and water resources that, are, you know, the agencies and our conservation goals. So, we have agribusiness that's coming in, and we often have agribusiness or developers that are coming into land bank for the future. So there's already developments planned or permitted on a lot of these areas where you might look around and think you're in the middle of nowhere and say, hey, we have all the time in the world. We're in the middle of nowhere. This is gorgeous, and in reality, you know, it's we're at a situation where all of these properties are at risk, either through more intensive land uses and or development. So Orlando is growing rapidly, right? And that's moving south. So here's the headwaters again, this red line. Here's Orlando up here, so Orlando's moving south. And then we have development from the East Coast encroaching. We have more intensive agriculture, and we have a lot of people moving to the area. Florida's growing by 300,000 people a year. We're one of the fastest growing states in the country. Everyone wants to live here. I don't blame them. It's perfect. But so again, as you said, we're under the gun.
Yeah. Tom, is there something you'd like to add about what is the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge from your perspective, and maybe any backstory that you have on how it came to be?
Well, first, I'd like to say that I think Julie very eloquently and very thoroughly explained almost everything about the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. And some of what I'll say is maybe redundant, but maybe I can hit on some of the key points from my perspective as a conservation scientist. And I am working with Julie. We've been partners for a long time on projects, both statewide projects, but also specifically projects in the southern half of Florida, this South Central Florida region that goes from Orlando to Lake Okeechobee, and then southwest along the southwest coast from the Sarasota area down to Naples. But I also work at a statewide scale on a number of projects, including the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And one of the first things I'd like to say is the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge is one of the most important, if not the most important, priority area for conservation in the state of Florida. We have lots of conservation priorities in Florida, and we need a lot more money spent on land conservation programs. There's a lot of need in Florida to move quickly because of the pace at which we're growing in terms of human population and development. But the Everglades Headwaters, when it was started, it was very timely because this has been a priority area for decades, even before the refuge effort started. And having this new refuge brought more partners to the table, potentially more funding to the table. And that made it much more likely that we were going to protect these high conservation priorities in this landscape. And Julie covered this. I just want to emphasize that, the Everglades Headwaters is huge. It does go all the way from Orlando, And it's a little fact, but I think it's an interesting fact that it actually literally starts on the Walt Disney World property in Reedy Creek, which flows into the Kissimmee chain of lakes. And then south of Kissimmee, the Kissimmee chain of lakes, you have the Kissimmee River, and that flows into Okeechobee, Lake Okeechobee. And then you have the River of Grass, right? You also have the Everglades agricultural area and other changes that humans have brought to the landscape. But that watershed covers much of the southern half of the Florida Peninsula, literally all the way from Orlando, all the way to Florida Bay and Everglades National Park. And Florida Bay is the watershed, the area that is around the western side of the whole northern half of the Florida Keys. So it's a huge, huge ecosystem. And if you know anything about watershed protection, landscape ecologists, hydrologists all agree that protecting headwaters is especially important. So the name of the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge signifies that fact. If you want to protect and restore the Everglades ecosystem, protecting and restoring the hydrology of this Everglades headwaters area is especially important. In terms of species, Julie hit the highlights, the fact that this area is critical for the Florida panther, also the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is found nowhere else but in the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge region. But from a refuge perspective and a Endangered Species Act perspective, the refuge landscape is also extremely important to a host of other listed and focal species, including the eastern indigo snake, which is federally listed, the scrub jay, which is federally listed, Everglades snail kite, and the crested caracara. And specifically, the crested caracara is a bird species typically found further west in the United States, but it's a subspecies of caracara, and it's specifically adapted to this open landscape that these ranches provide. So that federally listed species is really dependent on maintaining this ranch landscape.
I remember the first time I saw a crested caracara in South Texas, I was like, what prehistoric bird is that? Like, when did I travel back in time? And, the birds get all the glory, but for me, the snakes are my favorite, I'll be honest. So, Tom, I just want to summarize what you just said there for a second. It's because it sounds to me like there's something in a name. The headwaters, Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge is a refuge unto itself. It stands by itself. It's obviously important because of the species that you've listed, because of the impact that it has on the community that abuts it and near abuts it. But what I'm hearing you say is that this National Wildlife Refuge has direct connection downstream to many other National Wildlife Refuges and other important areas. Can you just walk us back through that for a second? Just make the connection to Ding Darling, make the connection to Loxahatchee, make the connection to, what most of us think about when we think about the Everglades and this, river of grass. Talk about how the headwaters is important to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're exactly right. The headwaters, the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, the water that flows through the refuge and south through the Kissimmee River to Lake Okeechobee could literally end up in or adjacent to the various refuges that you listed further south in the watershed, including Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge in Southeast Florida, which is part of the Everglades system proper south of Lake Okeechobee. Also, Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. Technically, it is part of the Everglades watershed. It's in the southwest part of the tip of the Florida Peninsula, east of Naples. But it also is part of this watershed and is downstream of the Everglades headwaters. And then two other refuges that are considered to be extremely important. Ding Darling is, I think, a world famous national wildlife refuge. It receives outflow from Lake Okeechobee through the Clusatchee River, which is connected to Lake Okeechobee. And the health of the Kissimmee River, the Everglades headwaters, Lake Okeechobee, the Clusatchee River directly affect the ecological integrity of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. And another refuge that we don't talk about as much is 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge, which is adjacent to the northwest portion of Everglades National Park, is also in this watershed. So all of those national wildlife refuges are directly dependent on us getting the job done in terms of conserving the right properties inside the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, and also working on restoring hydrology in the Headwaters Refuge. One of the things we haven't talked about so far is one of the things these ranches provide is a great opportunity to restore wetlands. All of these ranches in the distant past, in the 1920s, remember when we had people who were working very hard to replumb the Everglades, to change the flow of water, to drain parts of the Everglades, much as South Florida was drained. They built a number of canals and ditches and other features to try to drain this vast wetland ecosystem. And that happened on ranches too, back in the day. So one of the things that we can do if these lands are protected, these ranches are protected either through conservation easements or in some cases through buying them and turning them to things like wildlife management areas, is there is a vast opportunity to restore wetlands or to just hold water back in depressions and former wet areas and helping to treat the water before it flows into the Kissimmee River and flows into Lake Okeechobee. So we're protecting the intact features, the intact wetlands and floodplains within this landscape, but we also have a great opportunity to restore wetlands in this landscape as well.
So it sounds to me, Tom, like what you're saying is if you care about wetlands or you care about important species or you care about national wildlife refuges or you care about public access or you care about recreation, you care about safe drinking water, this is a refuge you should be caring about. That's a powerful message. Julie, it looked like you might have something you wanted to add to what Tom just said.
I just wanted to add on to what Tom said, and I think we might talk about our Beyond the Boundaries work in a little bit. But Tom mentioned the restoration opportunities, and one of the programs that we work with is the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, their wetland restoration easement program, or WRE program, and that's another tool we leverage in the Headwaters, where that's an easement program that actually looks at areas that have been ditched and drained and restores those wetlands, puts water back on the landscape. Because our goal here is to put water back on the landscape. This was almost a sheet flow, right, on this, in this area we call the Headwaters, and that water slowly moved from Orlando south and drained into the Kissimmee River. And so this was an area filled with, a vast wetland type system, and it was filled with wet and dry prairies and that naturally stored water, and then they overflowed, of course, in the wet season. And so we want to restore that hydrological regime. But one thing I also want to mention is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or whatever that saying is. A lot of these ranches are already holding a tremendous amount of water. One of the priority projects we work on, a 12,000 acre ranch just north of the Lake Okeechobee, that ranch is underwater 6 months out of the year, right? So, you have to take a airboat or a canoe through a large part of that ranch. So in the dry season, it's dry, or it's mostly dry, but in the wet season, it's already doing the job of, holding and storing and filtering and cleaning that water before it gets to the Kissimmee River and Lake Okeechobee. So, we have to look at, economics when we're trying to, fight for land conservation funding. And we hear maybe, policymakers say, well, that's so much money. Well, how much money is it when down the road, when we've developed that landscape and we have impervious surface and water rushing right off that impervious surface into the river and into Lake Okeechobee? How much is that to develop the engineering fixes to fix that problem? And it's a lot more money than purchasing a conservation easement or buying some land outright. So I just wanted to say that there's tremendous restoration opportunities on these ranches, but a lot of them are already doing the job that they were intended to do, right? They're capturing and storing and cleaning that water.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing a future episode about the economic impact of
Yeah.
conservation in places like Florida. You don't have to look back too far to remember a bad red tide year, which had significant
Yes.
impacts on people's tourism, day to day lives in Florida. And there are direct links to water quality issues that can go a long way to having major economic impact. So this is a pretty broad ranging issue. Julie and Tom, you both mentioned about some of the different ways that you're working and mentioned the connectivity of the Headwaters to the rest of the state's kind of conservation efforts. So, talk to me a little bit about how the two of you work together. Like, how does that work? What's the dynamic duo between the two of you? Julie, I know you mentioned that earlier that part of what makes the special sauce, if you will, of your work is that you're focused on some of the most important areas. Help us understand how you come to the conclusion about what those are, and Tom, talk to us about how you and Julie part.
So I think I'll let Tom speak to much of this, but Tom and I have been working together since 2008, I believe, and I think we've worked together on virtually all of or most of our conservation projects for over 12 years now. And I think you can think of us maybe as I'm on the ground person, and he's developing the science. And then together we work on the policy, if that makes sense. But I mentioned, we advocate or work to secure funding. And then we implement projects on the ground. We are involved, when I say implement projects, we are involved working with landowners and agencies to protect, to do the land protection work. But in the middle there is the really, really important part. And that's the work that Tom does with his, in his work in his auspices with University of Florida. And I'll let Tom talk about his work because he's better speaking about it than I am. But what helps me and helps the agencies is I use the work that Tom develops, the data that Tom develops, and we work together to identify, okay, where are the most strategic areas for conservation? And I couldn't do that without the partnership with University of Florida. So since I've come on with the Refuge Association, Tom and University of Florida have been our partners. And because of that partnership, we are really able to hone in on the most important areas for our water and wildlife corridors. But Tom, I'll let you talk a bit about how our partnership works.
Well, I think I should start by saying that I have been doing the kind of work that I do in terms of helping the state identify the places that are most important to protect, because we can't protect it all. So we need to make sure that we have the best available science to guide the planning and then the implementation. Identify the areas that need to be protected based on wildlife considerations, wildlife corridor, water resource considerations, other types of ecosystem services, including considering things like protecting coastlines from tropical storms and hurricanes. All of that comes into play in the work that I do. I have been doing this kind of work since the early 1990s. It started with work on wildlife corridors and a statewide wildlife corridor plan, which I think we'll talk about more in a minute. But it over the years has morphed into more general conservation planning, including sometimes more specific conservation planning. I work with a number of entities on specific listed species or other focal species conservation plans. And by focal species, I mean species that we're interested in conserving. They're declining, maybe they're state listed, maybe they're federally listed, maybe they're a rare species. They're one that we know needs conservation attention. So I've been doing wildlife corridor planning, specific species planning, and now more water resource and ecosystem service planning in a number of applied projects in Florida since literally the 1990s. And a lot of that is spatial analysis. There's a tool called geographic information systems that most people are familiar with these days if they work in the conservation field. It's not just making maps though. We have maps that we've shared with you and that you can use to show some of the things that we're talking about. And Julie has been pointing to maps as we've been having our conversation. But it's more than that. You can do really high level, complicated spatial modeling that helps you determine specific priorities for a specific resource, like a particular species, like the Florida panther. And then you can put all of those models for specific resources together into cumulative models showing, with everything factored in, what are the places that rise to the top? What's the cream? What are the places that are most strategic to conserve Florida's biodiversity, its wildlife, its water resources, its other ecosystem services? And Julie and I started working together on those kinds of projects starting in 2008. If I remember correctly, we were working both on a Southwest Florida Water Management District project, which was specifically about helping the Water Management District do a better job of identifying the areas that they should be protecting. The Florida's Water Management District historically spent quite a bit of money on protecting land to protect water resources, but also wildlife. And we were helping Southwest Florida Water Management District to do that. And then very soon after that, we started working with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission on something that they called the Cooperative Conservation Blueprint, or CCB. It was an outgrowth of the state's Wildlife Action Plan, something that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually asked all the states to do. They asked each of the states to create a wildlife action plan. But Florida, because of all the planning that we started in the 1990s, we were way ahead of the game in many ways, but we still needed to work on incentives-based conservation, figuring out ways to strategically work and proactively work with landowners who own properties that are most strategic for conservation and come up with a tool set that could convince them to protect their properties through things like conservation easements, or provide management money so that they could better manage habitat for species like the gopher tortoise or the Florida panther, or store water on their properties, or restore wetlands on their properties. That's what that CCB, that Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission project, was all about. And a lot of the work that Julie and I have done since then, whether it was for the state or whether it was for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies, whether it was in partnership with other NGOs, has been all about that, either at a statewide scale or in this focal region in South Florida. Let's make sure, if we've limited conservation dollars, that we bring the best available science. And science is always changing, right? We're always getting better data about what's most important for conservation. So it's my job to keep on top of that with partners, with my other science partners, and then work with people like Julie to bring that into the policy setting. Because one of the frustrations that I have as a conservation scientist who creates lots of data and maps is that sometimes we make maps and we have these great plans and we identify all these properties, but then somebody takes that report and puts it on a shelf, right? It doesn't guarantee, just because you've identified it as being significant for conservation, does not guarantee that that property is going to get protected. And so it's really important for somebody like me to be working in the applied policy context, because what Julie's doing is we both interface in that policy world, but she's actually taking the next step. She's working with those same agencies on the actual implementation. Let's make sure that we're using all this strategic science-based information to target the most important properties and talk to those landowners and make sure that, obviously, these landowners have to be willing. These programs are voluntary. They have to want to be involved. So Julie's job is to work with other partners, other federal, state agencies, and other NGOs to meet with these landowners, discuss options, and come up with implementation strategies to get the land protected.
And I'm sure you can do all of that, Julie, just over Zoom or a couple of conference calls a week, right? You don't have to get out there and hustle much.
Yeah, I just came in from the beach a few minutes ago.
Well, that's Florida.
For this. Yeah.
That makes perfect
Yeah.
sense. All jokes aside, I see the National Wildlife Refuge Association talking about conservation beyond the boundaries. And I don't always know exactly what that means. I did have a conversation not too long ago with a colleague of yours, Steve Jester, who also has done a lot of beyond the boundaries work for the National Wildlife Refuge Association. And he had a really interesting term when he was talking about it, the idea of white-siders, meaning those people that only are worried about what happens on the boundary of the National Wildlife Refuge are the ones who are standing on the other side of the boundary sign and only see the white side. They don't really think beyond the boundary. But your work obviously must, because the boundary is not, for Headwaters at least, not fully realized yet. You're bringing together this broad and disparate group of stakeholders, from landowners to state agencies to federal agencies, and bringing in resources from all of these different places. Can you just talk about how, the concept of conservation beyond the boundaries is relevant to Headwaters, and how it affects the work that you're doing?
Sure. So there's, so many ways you could look at beyond the boundaries, right? And it's a great term. I don't know who coined it, but it's definitely appropriate. But number one, I just want to talk about Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. That is truly the headwaters to the rest of the Everglades, right? It's the headwaters to that greater Everglades system. Florida, think about Florida. It's pretty flat. It's maybe gently sloping. It is gently sloping. It's one giant sheet flow, right? So whatever you do up here, let me pull up one of my maps. Whatever you do up here is going to have a direct impact down here, right? When we're just talking about water quality. Does that make sense? So it's, think of one giant sheet flow and water slowly trickling down. And so our water quality in the headwaters directly impacts the water quality, quantity, supply to Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge down here, to 10,000 Islands, to Ding Darling. So, anything you do upstream is going to impact the health and integrity of the refuges downstream. And I think Tom mentioned that before. Another thing when we're talking about beyond the boundaries, unless you have a species of wildlife that's range is, really, really limited, in order to protect the wildlife that these refuges were established for. A really great example is Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. The Florida Panther needs a lot of range. It has a large territory. It's not staying within the boundaries of the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. In order for us to have a viable population of panthers, we are going to have to protect corridors from, here's where the panther stronghold is, down here, Big Cypress, this area. We're going to have to protect corridors all the way up from Big Cypress, the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge, through these ranch lands, through these protected lands, up through the headwaters and beyond. So when we're talking about wildlife don't recognize boundaries, right? Water, our watersheds do not recognize, fence lines. Florida, let's just talk about management issues in Florida. Florida is ground zero when it comes to exotic and invasive species, right? We're a subtropical environment. We get everything. So, unless you're managing that land very, very intensively, we are always going to be dealing with, when I say intensively, I mean, constantly on the lookout for invasive and exotic species, flora and fauna, so those exotic species don't recognize boundaries, right? So what happens when you have a finite piece of land that that is a national wildlife refuge, but right next to it, you have golf course communities or subdivisions or more intensive development? All of the exotic and endangered species that types of land use brings in, that's going to directly impact that national wildlife refuge, right? So we want to buffer, we want to protect the lands around national wildlife refuges as best as we can too, or have lesser intensive land uses. So whatever you do impacts your neighbor. And I don't know, Tom, maybe you can say it, more eloquently. I'm sure you can, but I just think about it in a nutshell. Whatever we do upstream has direct impacts downstream. Our wildlife in our national wildlife refuges don't respect that boundary or fence line, right? For us to have those populations that, are biologically viable, we have to work beyond the boundaries and work on a landscape level.
Well, I think it's fascinating to see the connectivity here. Having spent a lot of time in Florida since I was a kid, many of us who travel to Florida, if you're a west coast of Florida person, there's just nothing past I-75 towards the interior. That's just flyover country. And if you're an East Coast Florida person, you don't cross I-95. That's just, lost country on the inside there. And what you're saying is that those places are directly connected to the rest of Florida. And I think that that's a powerful message. I want to do this last question as a bit of a lightning round for both of you, and it goes like this. So you both have laid out a strong case for the importance of Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge, the impact that it has around the state and beyond. What does a successful vision look like? What do we look like in 5 or 10 years when we are successful? What's the future here? And try to sum this up, help our listeners really understand what it is that is at stake and what could be if we're successful. And Tom, I'm going to let you go first.
There are several different things that I think are essential. If we are going to achieve our conservation goals in the Everglades headwaters, but in the area that surrounds Everglades headwaters and the state as a whole, it starts with we have to protect the higher priorities in the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And I wanted to make the connection. Some people may have heard the term Florida Wildlife Corridor. The Florida Wildlife Corridor is a public education outreach campaign to highlight the importance of the higher priorities in the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. So the Florida Ecological Greenways Network is a state plan. Florida Wildlife Corridor is an NGO that's helping to publicize the fact that we have this opportunity to protect a statewide corridor network, but it's a race against time that we have to work very quickly. But we will not accomplish a lot of our important goals without protecting the high priorities in the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. Specifically in the Everglades headwaters or in the Everglades watershed north of Lake Okeechobee, it means in the future tens of thousands of restored wetland acres. And that opportunity exists, but we've got to protect these ranches first, or specifically protect them with programs like the Wetland Reserve Easement Program from the NRCS to accomplish that goal of wetland restoration. If we don't do that, we won't achieve the water restoration or watershed restoration goals that we have for South Florida. We talked about the economic impacts of poor water quality, the fact that we've had these big algae blooms, both freshwater and saltwater algae blooms like red tide on both coasts of Southeast, Southwest Florida, directly related to the Everglades headwaters. If we're going to preserve Florida's tourism economy, you've got to protect and restore wetlands in the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. Those things are absolutely connected. So those are two. I'll leave it at that for now. Those are two things that we have to do. That's part of the vision to do what needs to be done to be successful.
Tom, thank you very much. That's perfect. Julie, you get to take us home here. Give us your vision. Give us what does it look like when you succeed?
Well, so I think Tom did a great job, pointing out a functional wildlife corridor, right? So when we say functional wildlife corridor, and I'm going to hold up this map right here of the headwaters. Let me hold up this one. When he says that, see these green areas right here? Those are what we call conservation hubs, right? Avon Park, Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. These are large conservation hubs. We're trying to connect these big green areas with other big green areas to make it really simple. So there's a pathway or a way for animals to move north, south, east, west. So think about Florida, right? If it's not protected, chances are in 50 years, 100 years, it's going to be developed in some fashion. So our goal is to have as much of these green areas on the map as we can. And that means protected outright for public recreation land and also conservation easements. When we do conservation easements, right, we're also protecting the local agricultural economy, right? We are protecting that cultural heritage and that local economy, that mainstay of this economy, which is cattle ranching. So functional wildlife corridors viable populations of these species that are on the edge right now of blinking out. The Florida grasshopper sparrow is not in good shape. It's on a few public lands and a few ranches that are left. We have to protect those areas if we want a viable population of the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is a pretty good indicator of ecosystem health. They exist only in this landscape on dry prairie, a globally imperiled ecosystem. So that's one species. Well, another species would be a viable population of the Florida panther. Science tells us how many animals we need in order to have a viable population. That means protecting enough land in this landscape where we can bring panthers up from Big Cypress up through this landscape and beyond. A healthy hydrological regime. That means, as Tom said, protecting and restoring tens of thousands of acres of wetlands, putting that water back on the landscape so it stores, filters, and cleans that water before it gets to the Kissimmee River, right here. Cleaning this water that flows into the Kissimmee River, flows into Lake Okeechobee, and affects our wildlife refuges downstream. So corridors, wildlife, water. I think those would be the big three, and our agricultural economy in the region. So I think those would be the four main tenets or measures of success.
Great.
KB, I would love to add one more thing to that. It goes back to the question of what it will take to be successful, but it also ties into a vision. Julie mentioned partnerships multiple times, but we can't accomplish these goals without effective partnerships between federal, state agencies, as well as potentially regional and local government, but also conservation and other NGOs. And the fact is that what we really need to accomplish those goals is we need Julie. We need Julie Morris, because one of the things that's true, and she can protest, but one of the things that's true is I've been working this business for 30 years, and Julie is the best that person in terms of her expertise, personality, ability to work with, in a creative way, a multiple set of partners through this very complicated jurisdictional and political landscape to help get conservation deals done. And it is a complicated type of work. It's really hard to get federal and state agencies to work together, to cost share on a conservation easement project to make it happen. We almost can't protect a property that's thousands of acres in size without using multiple sources of funding to do so. And Julie excels at working with a variety of partners to get those kinds of deals done. She has been essential to the success of the Everglades Headwaters, and her continued involvement in Everglades Headwaters work is really important for accomplishing that vision that we've been talking about.
So I'm a bit embarrassed, Tom. Thank you. And I could say the exact same of you. So thank you. Well, yes. So you all, I have a rancher meeting that folks are coming to town. So I have to leave. My apologies.
Great example, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's better than an Irish goodbye, Julie. So,
yeah.
Nice work. Listen, this is not the last time that we're going to have a conversation about this National Wildlife Refuge and Florida conservation, because the issue is a priority for the National Wildlife Refuge Association, and should be a priority for anyone who cares about climate change, species, habitat protection, public lands, safe drinking water, and the future of Florida. So thank you both for taking this time to chat with us today, and I look forward to checking back in with you. I know there's some big news that we're going to be talking about in the coming year that's taking place in Florida that we'll want to go back and revisit, want to dig a little deeper on, and we may even be able to spend an entire show just doing a glossary of terms and explaining those three-letter acronyms that get tossed about all over the place. But thank you both for taking the time to be on the show. Julie, good luck with your meeting, and Tom, we'll see you on the refuge.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Bye, you all. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Bye.